as evening settles over the city of Paris. Imagine the gentle patter of rain on cobblestone streets that have witnessed centuries of history unfold. The distant sound of church bells rolls across the cityscape, marking time in the same manner they did on the eve of one of history's most profound transformations. This is the story of the French Revolution, not merely as a series of dramatic events, but as a slow, inevitable tide of change that reshaped not just France, but our modern understanding of society itself. Tonight, as you rest and prepare for sleep, we will journey together through the narrow streets and grand palaces, through whispered conversations in crowded cafes where the scent of fresh bread mingles with revolutionary ideas, and through the lives of ordinary people and kings alike who found themselves carried along by currents of change they could barely comprehend. In understanding this revolution, its origins, its passions, its tragedies, and its enduring legacy, we gain perspective on our own times of uncertainty and transformation. So settle in, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to drift back to a France on the edge of monumental change, a world both remarkably different from and surprisingly similar to our own. If you find this journey soothing, consider subscribing and liking this video before you drift away into historical dreams. To understand the revolution that would transform France and inspire movements across the globe, we must first understand what it sought to overthrow, a social and political order known as the Ancien Regime, the old regime that had evolved over nearly 1,000 years of French history. Like a great oak whose roots reach deep into medieval soil, the France of the late 18th century was the product of centuries of gradual growth, accumulating traditions, privileges, and contradictions layer by layer through time. The story begins with the emergence of France itself from the fragmented lands that remained after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century. Imagine standing in a forest clearing as the first millennium of the Common Era draws to a close, watching as local lords establish control over small territories, gradually forming allegiances with a king who possessed more symbolic than actual power. The air would be filled with the sense of wood smoke and damp earth. The soundtrack, a mixture of church bells, animal calls, and the distant sounds of village life. This was a world organized according to a principle that would endure for centuries: the division of society into 3 orders, or estates, each with distinct roles and privileges. The first estate consisted of the clergy, those who prayed for the salvation of all. From humble parish priests in remote villages to powerful bishops and abbots who controlled vast landholdings, the church was woven into every aspect of daily life. Its rhythms, the tolling of bells, the cycle of religious festivals, the rituals of birth, marriage, and death, provided the framework around which ordinary people organized their existence. The church owned approximately 10% of all land in France, collected tithes from the population, and enjoyed exemption from most taxation. In the soft light of stained glass windows, amid the scent of incense and the murmur of Latin prayers, the church maintained its privileged position as the moral authority of society and keeper of education, charity, and social services. The second estate comprised the nobility, those who fought, at least in theory, to protect society. Approximately 350,000 nobles, less than 2% of the population, controlled nearly a third of the land and exercised significant legal privileges. Imagine walking through the French countryside, where the chateau of the local seigneur stands as a physical reminder of authority. Inside these elegant residences, nobles lived lives separated from ordinary people, not just by wealth, but by distinct codes of behavior, education, and cultural refinement. They spoke differently, dressed differently, and possessed legal rights that set them apart. Exemption from most taxation, exclusive hunting rights, collection of feudal dues from peasants, and access to military and court positions closed to commoners. The nobility was not monolithic. A vast gulf separated the splendid dukes and counts who graced the court at Versailles from the struggling country squires, who sometimes lived only marginally better than prosperous farmers. But all shared in the privilege of noble status. The third estate encompassed everyone else. Approximately 98% of the population, a diverse group united only by their status as non-nobles. At its base were the peasants who comprised over 80% of the population, working the land as they had for centuries, following the rhythms of planting and harvest. Some owned their own modest plots, while others labored as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Many lived in small, clustered villages of stone or timber houses, the church steeple serving as the center of community life. Their existence was precarious, vulnerable to the vagaries of weather, war, and disease. In years of good harvest, life might be simple but sustainable. In years of drought or flood, famine was never far away. Above the peasantry stood the urban working classes, artisans organized into guilds that regulated production and maintained standards, day laborers who sought work in the growing cities, and small shopkeepers who served local needs. The narrow streets of cities like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille were filled with the sounds of commerce and craft, the hammer of the blacksmith, the loom of the weaver, the cry of the street vendor. Apartments stacked above shops housed families in increasingly crowded conditions as cities grew beyond their medieval walls. At the upper levels of the Third Estate were the professionals and the bourgeoisie, lawyers, doctors, merchants, bankers, and manufacturers who often possessed wealth that exceeded that of many nobles but lacked their social status and legal privileges. These were people of education and ambition, readers of books and participants in the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. In their comfortable homes and in the new spaces of sociability, cafes, salons, and reading rooms, they discussed ideas of reason, natural rights, and the proper organization of society, ideas that would eventually provide the intellectual framework for revolution. Presiding over this complex social hierarchy was the monarchy, which had evolved over centuries from one feudal lord among many to an absolute authority claiming divine right to rule. The long reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled from 1643 to 1705, represented the apex of royal absolutism. Picture the magnificent Palace of Versailles, with its symmetrical gardens extending toward the horizon, its mirrored halls reflecting the glory of the monarchy, its elaborate rituals of court life designed to emphasize the king's central position. L'État, c'est moi. Yet absolutism in theory never translated to complete control in practice. The king ruled through a complex bureaucracy of ministers and intendants, negotiating with powerful interests including the church, the parlements, sovereign courts that could refuse to register royal edicts, provincial estates, and municipalities that jealously guarded their traditional rights. The France of the 18th century was less a unified nation-state than a patchwork of territories acquired over centuries, each with its own laws, customs, and privileges. Traveling from one province to another might mean encountering different systems of weights and measures, different taxation regimes, and even internal customs barriers that hampered trade. This complexity extended to the system of taxation, which embodied the inequities of the old regime. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt from the taille, the main direct tax, which fell heavily on the peasantry. Indirect taxes on salt, the gabelle, tobacco, and other necessities affected everyone but imposed a proportionally heavier burden on the poor. Tax collection was largely privatized, with tax farmers advancing money to the government and then recouping their investment plus profit through aggressive collection. The result was a system both inefficient and perceived as deeply unfair, unable to generate sufficient revenue for the state, despite the heavy burden it placed on much of the population. By the late 18th century, this social and political structure, stable for so long, was experiencing increasing strain. The ideas of the Enlightenment had begun to question traditional authorities and hierarchies based on birth. Economic changes were empowering the bourgeoisie while creating new forms of hardship for many workers and peasants. Population growth was putting pressure on resources, and the monarchy, which had accumulated enormous debt through its participation in expensive wars, was finding it increasingly difficult to reform a system whose privileged classes resisted any change that might diminish their position. As we move forward in our story, imagine standing at a crossroads in France in the 1780s. Behind you stretches the long history of the Ancien Regime, with its traditions, hierarchies, and accumulated contradictions. Ahead lies an unknown future, where questions of authority, representation, and the very nature of society will be contested with a passion and on a scale unprecedented in European history. The absolute monarchy that had seemed immutable was about to face challenges that would ultimately sweep it away, along with the entire social order it presided over. But this would not happen in a single moment of dramatic rupture. Rather, it would unfold through a complex sequence of events, driven by a mixture of long-term structural problems and immediate crises, of high principles and practical necessities, of noble aspirations and human frailties. As the soft light of evening settles over this old France, we turn now to the royal couple who would preside, unwittingly, over its final days. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, whose personal story would become inextricably entangled with the larger tragedy of a system unable to reform itself until it was too late. As twilight deepens over the magnificent gardens of Versailles, imagine the young couple walking slowly among the formal parterres and fountains, burdened already by the weight of crowns they never expected to wear. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, their names have become almost inseparable in historical memory, linked forever as symbols of monarchy overthrown. Yet behind these symbols were two complex human beings, neither villain nor saint, shaped by circumstances beyond their control and struggling, often ineffectually, to navigate a rapidly changing world. Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was never meant to be king. Born in 1754, he was the second son of the Dauphin of France, grandson of the reigning Louis XV. A shy, awkward child with a tendency toward melancholy, he found refuge in practical pursuits, locksmithing, map-making, and hunting, rather than the social graces expected at court. The death of his father in 1765, followed by his elder brother in 1767, suddenly placed him in direct line to the throne. Imagine the quiet, reserved boy of 13 now bearing the weight of expectation for which he had not been prepared. His education emphasized piety and moral rectitude, but provided little practical preparation for governance. Those who knew him described a young man of good intentions and moderate intelligence, conscientious but indecisive, kind-hearted but lacking the charisma that had defined French kingship under his predecessor, Louis XIV. Across the continent, in Vienna, a young archduchess was being groomed for a very different future than the one she anticipated. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, born in 1755 as the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, grew up in the relative informality of the Habsburg court. Her education was surprisingly superficial for a Habsburg princess. She arrived in France with limited fluency in French and little understanding of the rigid etiquette that would govern her every move at Versailles. Picture her journey in April 1770, leaving behind everything familiar as she traveled to a foreign land whose language she barely spoke, to marry a boy she had never met, in service of a diplomatic alliance between traditional enemies. Their marriage in May 1770 united two shy, awkward teenagers, he not quite 16, she just 14, in a lavish ceremony that symbolized the alliance between France and Austria. The public celebrations in Paris ended in tragedy when poor crowd control at a fireworks display resulted in 132 deaths, a somber omen for a union that would end in even greater tragedy. The young couple's personal relationship was complicated by an unconsummated marriage, a situation that persisted for 7 years and became the subject of international gossip, creating pressure on both young people and raising questions about the succession. 4 years after their marriage, on May 10, 1774, the dissolute Louis XV died of smallpox, and the young couple became King and Queen of France. "God help us, for we are too young to reign," Louis reportedly said, a poignant recognition of his own unreadiness for the enormous responsibilities that now fell upon him. At 19 and 18 respectively, Louis and Marie Antoinette inherited not just a throne, but a kingdom in crisis. Financially strained by decades of war, administratively tangled in a web of privileges and exemptions, and intellectually fermenting with new ideas about rights, representation, and the social contract. Louis XVI approached his new role with seriousness of purpose and genuine desire for reform. He appointed Jacques Turgot as Controller General of Finances, supporting his efforts to rationalize taxation, reduce expenditures, and liberalize the economy. He supported France's involvement in the American Revolution, a decision aligned with strategic interests against Britain, but one that would further deplete the treasury and expose French officers to Republican ideas. He showed personal interest in exploration, science, and technology, funding voyages of discovery and supporting innovations. In many ways, he embodied the ideal of an enlightened monarch. Moderate, humane, he abolished torture in the judicial system and open to gradual change. Yet these admirable qualities were counterbalanced by significant limitations. Louis lacked the force of personality to impose his will on competing court factions. His habit of indecision, giving assent to reforms only to withdraw support when faced with opposition from privileged groups, undermined his effectiveness. His personal piety and sense of tradition made him hesitant to challenge established institutions too directly. And his isolated upbringing at Versailles left him disconnected from the realities of ordinary French life, making it difficult for him to gauge the true state of public opinion or the urgency of necessary changes. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, faced the considerable challenge of establishing herself in a foreign court, often hostile to Austrian influence. Imagine the young queen, surrounded by the splendor of Versailles, but also by intrigue and criticism, trying to find her place in a system of etiquette so elaborate that every moment of her day was regulated by tradition. Her failure to produce an heir for the first 7 years of her marriage, until the birth of her first child in 1778, made her position precarious and subject to cruel speculation. In response to these pressures, she created her own world within the court, a circle of favored friends, a retreat to the Petit Trianon where she could escape the formalities of Versailles, a preference for simple muslin dresses over court finery. These choices, which might seem innocent enough to modern sensibilities, violated expectations for a French queen and fueled criticism that she remained Austrian at heart. Her spending on fashion, gambling, and the redecoration of her private spaces, though not unusual for her position, earned her the nickname Madame Deficit at a time of financial crisis. And her close friendship with the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen sparked rumors of infidelity, though historians remain divided on whether their relationship ever crossed the line from deep attachment to physical affair. The birth of 4 children between 1778 and 1786, Marie Therese, Louis Joseph, Louis Charles, and Sophie, brought personal happiness, but also shifted Marie Antoinette's focus increasingly toward her maternal role. The death of their youngest daughter Sophie in 1787, followed by the declining health of the Dauphin Louis Joseph, who would die of tuberculosis in 1789, brought sorrow that coincided with the mounting political crisis. As personal tragedy mingled with public turmoil, the Queen became more involved in political matters, generally advocating for resistance to reform that would diminish royal authority. What makes the story of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette particularly poignant is that they were, in many ways, decent people trapped in roles for which their temperaments and training had not prepared them. Neither possessed the political genius or force of character that might have enabled them to navigate successfully between necessary reform and preservation of the monarchy. Their virtues, his conscientiousness, her devotion to family, were private ones that did little to help them manage public crises. Their flaws, his indecisiveness, her political naivete, proved fatal in a time that demanded clear vision and decisive action. As darkness falls over Versailles and candles illuminate the Hall of Mirrors, we leave the royal couple for now, still unaware of the gathering storm. In the years to come, they will face challenges they cannot imagine, make decisions that will seal their fate, and ultimately meet an end that would have seemed impossible in these early years of their reign. But to understand how events unfolded toward that conclusion, we must turn now to the multiple crises, financial, social, political, and environmental, that were creating revolutionary conditions throughout France by the mid-1780s. Imagine standing in a Parisian bread shop in the winter of 1788, watching as the price of a loaf rises day by day, beyond what many can afford. The woman behind the counter shrugs helplessly. Flour costs more, so bread costs more. Outside, a light snow begins to fall, adding to the misery of the coldest winter in living memory. Through the frosted window, you can see a line forming at the pawnbroker across the street, people selling treasured possessions to buy food for their children. This is not an isolated scene, but one repeated across France as a series of interconnected crises, environmental, economic, financial, and political, created the conditions for revolutionary change. The environmental crisis was the most immediate, though its roots intertwined with longer-term problems. The 1780s witnessed a series of extreme weather events across Europe, possibly linked to the Laki volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, which ejected enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, disrupting weather patterns. The summer of 1785 brought severe drought to much of France, damaging crops. Then came the catastrophic winter of 1788 to 1789, one of the coldest on record. The Seine River froze solid in Paris. Snow lay deep across the countryside from November until April. Farmers watched helplessly as winter wheat was killed by frost, fruit trees died, and livestock perished from cold and lack of fodder. When spring finally came, it brought not relief but flooding, as the rapidly melting snow swelled rivers beyond their banks, washing away soil from the precious planted fields. The result was a disastrous harvest in 1789, coming on the heels of the already poor harvest of 1788. The price of bread, the staple food that could comprise up to 50% of a worker's budget, doubled or tripled in many areas. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease. Rural artisans found fewer customers for their wares, as peasants devoted all resources to buying food. In the cities, the poor went hungry, while watching grain merchants and speculators profit from scarcity. The sound of hungry children crying haunted many households, urban and rural alike. This environmental crisis struck a country already facing significant economic challenges. France in the late 18th century was experiencing what some historians have called a proto-industrial revolution. Not yet the full factory system that was beginning to transform England, but a significant expansion of manufacturing through the putting-out system, where merchants provided raw materials to rural workers who produced goods in their homes. Traditional guild restrictions were being circumvented, creating more flexible production, but also more precarious employment. Rural families increasingly depended on a combination of agricultural work and manufacturing piecework, making them vulnerable when either sector faltered. Population growth exacerbated these pressures. The number of French people had increased from about 18 million in 1700 to nearly 30 million by 1789, without corresponding increases in agricultural productivity. In rural areas, this led to the subdivision of already small peasant holdings into parcels barely capable of supporting a family, creating a class of near-landless laborers desperate for work. In cities, it meant crowded housing, competition for jobs, and heightened sensitivity to increases in food prices. The financial crisis of the state overlaid and intensified these socioeconomic problems. The roots of this crisis reached back decades to the expensive wars fought under Louis XV, the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and especially the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which saw France lose most of its overseas empire to Great Britain. Louis XVI's government had then supported the American Revolution against Britain, a policy successful in geopolitical terms but disastrous financially. The direct costs of the American War added about 1 billion livres to the national debt in an era when the government's annual revenue was only about 500 million livres. Imagine sitting in the office of the Controller General of Finances, looking at account books showing that nearly half of all government revenue was being devoted to servicing the existing debt, leaving insufficient funds for current operations even before considering new expenditures. The logical solution would be to increase taxation. But here, the structure of the Ancien Regime presented a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The nobility and clergy, who controlled a disproportionate share of the national wealth, were largely exempt from direct taxation. Attempts to impose new taxes on these privileged orders, or to reform the tax system to make it more efficient and equitable, met with fierce resistance. A succession of finance ministers, Turgot, Necker, Calonne, and finally Brienne, attempted various reforms, only to be blocked by entrenched interests. Turgot's attempts to liberalize the grain trade and abolish the corvée, forced labor on roads, led to his dismissal in 1776, after just 2 years in office. Necker, who served from 1777 to 1781, relied heavily on loans rather than addressing the structural issues, temporarily masking the problem while making it worse in the long term. Calonne, who succeeded him, attempted a more comprehensive reform, proposing a new land tax that would apply to all property owners regardless of social status, but was undone when he revealed the extent of the financial crisis to an assembly of notables in 1787. With each failed reform attempt, the government's options narrowed. By 1788, under the ministry of Brienne, France was effectively bankrupt, unable to meet its obligations. The sounds of this crisis were the scratch of quills as lenders demanded higher interest rates, the rustle of paper as new reform proposals were drafted and then rejected, and eventually, the silence of a treasury that could no longer pay its bills. The political crisis that emerged from these financial difficulties was not simply about money, but about the fundamental nature of authority in the French state. The Parlement, sovereign courts that had the right to register royal edicts before they could become law, emerged as centers of resistance to fiscal reform, ironically positioning themselves as defenders of tradition and liberty, while primarily protecting aristocratic privilege. The Parlement of Paris, in particular, became a forum where fundamental questions about sovereignty were debated. Did ultimate authority rest with the king alone, as absolutist theory maintained? Or was the king bound by certain fundamental laws and historical constitutions that limited his power, as the parlementaires argued? When the government attempted to circumvent the parlements through lit de justice ceremonies, where the king personally imposed registration of edicts, or by exiling recalcitrant judges, public opinion increasingly sided with the resistance. Pamphlets proliferated, discussions in cafes and salons grew more political, and a sense developed that France was experiencing not merely a financial emergency, but a constitutional crisis that called for fundamental reconsideration of how the country should be governed. By the summer of 1788, the government of Brienne had reached an impasse. Unable to impose new taxes through the Parlement, unable to borrow at sustainable rates, and facing mounting unrest, the ministry made a fateful decision to convoke the Estates General, a representative assembly of the three orders of French society that had not met since 1614. The announcement, made on July 5, 1788, seemed to offer a way out of the immediate crisis. The Estates General would have the authority to approve new taxes and address the financial emergency. But it also opened questions about representation, power, and the very structure of French society that would soon move beyond anything the government had anticipated. The ensuing months saw an unprecedented public debate about how the Estates General should be organized. Traditionally, the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commons, would meet separately, each with one vote, effectively giving the privileged orders a 2-to-1 advantage. But reformers argued for doubling the representation of the Third Estate to reflect its much larger population, and for voting by head rather than by order, which would allow the Third Estate to form coalitions with sympathetic members of the other orders. Pamphlets and cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances to be presented to the king, circulated throughout the country, raising expectations that the Assembly would address not just fiscal issues, but the whole range of political, social, and economic problems. In a partial concession, the government agreed in December 1788 to double the representation of the Third Estate, but left the crucial question of voting procedures unresolved. As preparations continued for the opening of the Estates General in May 1789, the political atmosphere was charged with both hope and tension. The sound of this moment was the rustle of paper as thousands of local assemblies drafted their cahiers, the murmur of unprecedented political discussions in village squares and urban cafes, and the creaking of a system under strain. And through it all, the environmental and economic crises continued to deepen. The terrible winter gave way to a spring of food shortages and high prices. Rural areas experienced an increase in begging and vagabondage as the destitute sought help wherever they might find it. Urban areas saw food riots as women, traditionally responsible for family provisioning, protested prices they considered unjust or seized grain shipments to force sales at a just price. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood as crowds entered bakeries or granaries became increasingly common. These interconnected crises, environmental, economic, financial, and political, created a situation where ordinary people were suffering material hardship while simultaneously being invited to participate in an unprecedented national conversation about rights, representation, and the future of France. The revolutionary situation was not created by Enlightenment philosophy alone, nor by economic hardship alone, nor by political blockage alone, but by the explosive combination of all these elements at a particular historical moment. As spring turned to summer in 1789, France was a powder keg awaiting a spark. That spark would come not in the form of a single dramatic event, but through a series of escalating confrontations centered on the estates. General confrontations that would transform a reform initiative into a revolutionary moment. The deputations from across France were converging on Versailles, bringing with them the hopes, fears, and grievances of a nation in crisis. Among them were individuals whose names were still unknown, but who would soon emerge as the voices and leaders of a revolution. Mirabeau, Sieyès, Barnave, and countless others who believed that France stood on the threshold of regeneration. As night deepens and stars appear above a France in turmoil, we turn now to the dramatic events of the spring and summer of 1789, when the Estates General would transform itself from an advisory body summoned by the king into a national assembly, claiming to represent the sovereignty of the nation. The first revolutionary act in a process that would eventually sweep away the entire old regime. On a mild May morning in 1789, the deputies to the Estates General processed through the streets of Versailles toward the Church of St. Louis, where a mass would inaugurate their assembly. Imagine the colorful spectacle as the three orders marched in their distinctive attire. The clergy in ecclesiastical robes, the nobility in plumed hats and ceremonial swords, and the representatives of the Third Estate in plain black suits with white cravats. This ceremonial procession, with its visual emphasis on the separation and hierarchy of the orders, foreshadowed the conflicts to come. For even as the deputies united in prayer, fundamental disagreements about the nature and purpose of their assembly threatened to prevent any meaningful work before it could begin. The formal opening session took place the following day, May 5th, in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs at Versailles. The cavernous hall was arranged to reflect traditional distinctions, the clergy seated to the right of the throne, the nobility to the left, and the Third Estate at the rear. The king delivered a brief and general speech expressing hope that the assembly would address the financial crisis. The keeper of the seals outlined procedural matters. Then Jacques Necker, recalled as Director General of Finance, gave a lengthy but disappointingly vague address on the state of the royal finances, without providing the detailed accounting many had expected or offering a clear plan forward. But the most immediate issue was not financial but procedural. How would the Estates General operate? Would the three orders meet and vote separately, as tradition dictated, or would they meet together and vote by head, as reformers demanded? This question, seemingly technical, was in fact fundamental. Separate deliberation would maintain the traditional structure of French society and ensure that the privileged orders could block any reform that threatened their interests. Joint deliberation would implicitly recognize a new principle, that deputies represented not separate orders, but the nation as a whole, and that a majority of representatives, regardless of estate, should determine policy. The government, having failed to resolve this issue before the opening, now stood back as the orders themselves debated it. The result was 6 weeks of procedural stalemate. The clergy and nobility began verifying the credentials of their members separately, while the Third Estate refused to constitute itself as a separate body, insisting that verification should occur in a general assembly of all deputies. Day after day, the representatives of the Third Estate simply waited in their meeting hall, inviting the other orders to join them, but conducting no official business. This strategy, seemingly passive, was in fact a calculated risk. The Third Estate deputies, many of them lawyers and officials familiar with procedural tactics, understood that time was on their side. As the deadlock continued, public opinion, expressed in a flood of new pamphlets and journals taking advantage of the de facto freedom of the press, increasingly supported their position. The most influential of these publications was the Abbé Sieyes's What is the Third Estate?, which argued that the commons constituted the productive heart of the nation while the privileged orders were essentially parasitic. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. By early June, patience was wearing thin on all sides. Tentative efforts at compromise through a royal mediation had failed. On June 10, Sieyes proposed that the Third Estate issue a final invitation to the other orders and then proceed to verify credentials with whoever appeared. When few deputies from the privileged orders responded, the Third Estate took the momentous step, on June 17, of declaring itself the National Assembly, claiming the right to act on behalf of the nation even without the participation of the other orders. Imagine the tension in the hall as the vote was taken. The mixture of exhilaration and apprehension as deputies realized they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. 3 days later, on June 20, the deputies arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors locked, ostensibly for preparations for a royal session. Fearing an attempt to dissolve their new assembly, they reconvened at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, in a scene that would be immortalized in paintings and engravings, they took what became known as the tennis court oath, swearing not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon solid foundations. All but one of the deputies present took the oath, their right hands raised, their voices joining in a moment of collective commitment that transformed a procedural dispute into a revolutionary act. The sound of that oath, echoing in the austere space of the tennis court, announced that sovereignty was shifting from the monarch to a body claiming to represent the nation. The royal session, when it finally occurred on June 23rd, was an attempt by Louis XVI to reassert control over the process. In a speech drafted by royal advisors, the king annulled the decisions of the Third Estate, ordered the 3 orders to meet separately, and proposed a program of reforms that was substantial but preserved the essential structure of the ancien regime. After delivering this speech, the king departed, ordering the deputies to disperse. The nobility and most of the clergy obeyed. The Third Estate remained seated in silence. It was in this tense moment that Mirabeau, one of the most eloquent deputies, reportedly defied the royal master of ceremonies who reminded them of the king's order. "Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people and that we will leave only at the point of the bayonet." The deputies then proceeded to confirm their previous decisions and declare the inviolability of their members. The king, faced with this defiance and counseled by advisors who warned against using force, yielded. On June 27, he ordered the remaining deputies of the clergy and nobility to join what was now, in effect, if not yet in name, a single national assembly. This apparent victory for the Third Estate masked continuing tensions and uncertainties. The king had yielded on the immediate procedural issue, but not necessarily accepted the broader implications of the assembly's claims. Conservative nobles were pressing for a forceful response to what they saw as usurpation. Troops were being moved toward Paris and Versailles, ostensibly to maintain order, but potentially to intimidate the assembly or suppress popular unrest. The dismissal of the popular Necker on July 11 was widely interpreted as a sign that the court party had gained influence and was planning a coup against the assembly. Meanwhile, the assembly itself was beginning the enormous task of reimagining the French state. On July 9, it formally renamed itself the National Constituent Assembly, explicitly claiming the authority to write a constitution. Working through committees, it began to address not only the immediate financial crisis, but also fundamental questions about the organization of political power, the status of the church, the structure of local government, and the nature of citizenship. The debates within the assembly were thoughtful and often profound, reflecting the influence of Enlightenment political philosophy as well as practical administrative experience. Deputies drew on the writings of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and others, but also on models from antiquity, from other European states, and from the new United States of America, whose successful revolution and constitutional settlement offered an inspiring example. The atmosphere was one of high purpose and historical awareness, with deputies conscious that they were engaged in an unprecedented experiment in creating a new political order through deliberation rather than tradition or divine revelation. But these debates occurred against a backdrop of continuing crisis. Food shortages persisted in many areas. Rumors of aristocratic conspiracies and impending counter-revolution circulated widely. The presence of troops, many of them foreign regiments considered more reliable for crowd control, created a sense of threat. In Paris, where economic difficulties had led to the formation of a citizens' militia, tension was particularly high. The city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a signal that would either confirm the revolution's progress or announce its suppression. That signal would come not through the deliberate decision of any of the principal actors, but through a chain of events that began with panic and ended with violence. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. This event, which we will explore in the next section, would transform the political revolution initiated by the Estates General into a broader social upheaval, bringing the people of Paris and then the peasantry across France into direct action that fundamentally altered the country's trajectory. As twilight falls on the Assembly Hall at Versailles, where deputies continue their discussions late into the evening, we leave them for now, still believing that reform can be achieved through orderly deliberation, still hoping that the king will accept his role in a new constitutional order, still unaware of the tumultuous events that will soon sweep them along in directions few had anticipated. The transformation of the Estates General into the National Assembly represented a constitutional revolution in principle. The events of the coming weeks would begin to make that revolution a reality throughout French society. The summer of 1789 unfolded across France like a gathering storm, beginning with isolated flashes of lightning before building to a full tempest that would transform the landscape of French society. The revolutionary events that occurred between mid-July and early August moved at a pace that left contemporaries struggling to comprehend their significance, as authority structures that had endured for centuries crumbled in a matter of weeks. Let us walk through these summer days, feeling the mounting tension in the air, hearing the sounds of a people awakening to a new sense of their own power. In Paris, the dismissal of Necker on July 11 served as a catalyst for popular mobilization. Word spread quickly through the city's cafes, gardens, and public squares, interpreted not as a simple ministerial change, but as the beginning of a counter-revolutionary coup. Imagine standing in the gardens of the Palais Royal on the afternoon of July 12, where a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table and delivered an impassioned call to arms. Citizens, there is not a moment to lose. The dismissal of Necker is the signal for a St. Bartholomew of patriots. This very night, all the Swiss and German battalions will leave the Champ de Mars to massacre us all. The atmosphere was electric, with a mixture of fear and determination as crowds formed, searching for weapons with which to defend themselves against the anticipated attack. By the following day, July 13, much of Paris had taken on the character of an armed camp. Regular troops had withdrawn to the outskirts, leaving the city largely in the hands of citizen militias hastily organized by district. These forces lacked not only training but also adequate armaments, a deficiency they sought to remedy by searching for weapons at the Invalides and other locations. The sound of improvised workshops spread throughout the city as smiths and artisans fashioned pikes and other simple weapons. The visual symbol of this self-organization was the cockade, initially green ribbons distributed in the Palais Royal, soon replaced by the red and blue colors of Paris combined with the royal white to form what would become the tricolor emblem of the revolution. The morning of July 14 dawned hot and humid, with tension hanging in the air like the summer heat. Crowds converged on the Hôtel des Invalides, where they seized approximately 32,000 muskets but found little powder or shot. Attention then turned to the Bastille, a medieval fortress serving as a state prison, which was known to contain a substantial ammunition magazine. The Bastille stood as a powerful symbol of royal authority, its 8 towers rising 100 feet high, its walls 80 feet thick at the base, its drawbridges and moat creating a formidable barrier between the outer and inner courtyards. Though it held only 7 prisoners at the time, none of them political, its physical presence dominated the working-class district of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The events at the Bastille began not as an assault, but as a negotiation. Representatives of the crowd sought to speak with the governor, Delaunay, requesting the surrender of the ammunition stored there. Hours of inconclusive talks heightened tensions. Some members of the crowd entered the outer courtyard when a drawbridge was lowered to admit a delegation. Then, in circumstances that remained disputed, shots were fired. The crowd interpreted this as treachery, and what had been a tense standoff escalated into a siege. The assault on the Bastille lasted approximately 3 hours, with casualties on both sides. The arrival of French Guard units, who had defected to the popular cause, bringing with them cannon, proved decisive. Delaunay, recognizing the impossibility of his position and wishing to avoid the explosion of the powder magazine, surrendered the fortress on the condition that lives would be spared. But in the chaos that followed, he and several other defenders were killed by the crowd, their heads mounted on pikes and paraded through the streets, a grim foreshadowing of the violence that would recur throughout the revolution. The fall of the Bastille reverberated far beyond its immediate tactical significance. For Parisians, it represented a victory over perceived counter-revolutionary threats and the beginning of self-governance through a new municipal authority, the Commune, which quickly replaced royal officials. For the king and court at Versailles, it demonstrated that royal authority in the capital had collapsed and that troops could not be relied upon to suppress popular unrest. And for the nation as a whole, it became a symbolic date, the moment when the people directly entered the revolutionary process, not as passive spectators to elite political debates, but as active participants shaping events through collective action. The king's immediate response reflected the new reality of power. On July 15, he appeared before the National Assembly to announce the withdrawal of troops from Paris and the recall of Necker. On July 17, he visited Paris himself, accepting the tricolor cockade from the new mayor, Bailly, in a symbolic recognition of the changes that had occurred. The sound of Vive le Roi still echoed in the streets, but now it was conditional. The king was cheered not as an absolute monarch, but as a leader who appeared to accept the principles of a new constitutional order. While Paris established a new municipal government and citizen militia, soon formalized as the National Guard under the command of Lafayette, similar developments were occurring in cities and towns across France. News of the Bastille's fall traveled along post roads and river valleys, inspiring the formation of local revolutionary committees and guards in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and countless smaller communities. These bodies filled the vacuum left by the collapse of traditional royal administration, maintaining order and beginning to implement revolutionary changes at the local level. The sound of this transformation was the rhythm of civic oaths taken in town squares, the quiet rustle of new municipal registers being created, and the metallic ring of local guard units drilling in the summer sun. But the revolution was not confined to urban areas. Throughout July and early August, a wave of panic swept across the countryside, known as the Great Fear, Grande Peur. Rumors spread that brigands or foreign troops were approaching to destroy crops, or that aristocrats were plotting to starve the people by preventing the harvest. These fears, though largely unfounded, were made plausible by the genuine hardship rural communities had experienced in the preceding year, and by the breakdown of traditional authority structures. In response to these perceived threats, peasants in many regions armed themselves for defense, but their actions soon turned from protective to proactive, directing their frustration and anger against the local symbols of seigneurial power. Manor houses were invaded, often not to harm the inhabitants, but to burn the feudal documents that recorded the obligations peasants owed to their lords: annual payments, labor services, exclusive rights to hunting or operating mills. In some areas, chateaux were burned entirely, their contents looted, their owners forced to flee. The sounds of this rural revolution were the crackling of flames consuming centuries-old parchments, the crash of wrought iron gates being torn down, and the determined voices of peasants declaring they would no longer submit to feudal exactions. News of this rural uprising reached the National Assembly in Versailles with increasing urgency throughout late July. Deputies debated how to respond to a situation that threatened to spiral into general anarchy, but also recognized that simple repression was neither practically possible nor consistent with their own critiques of the old order. The result was one of the most remarkable sessions in French parliamentary history, the night of August 4 to 5, 1789. The session began routinely enough, but took a dramatic turn when the Vicomte de Noailles, a liberal nobleman, proposed addressing the rural unrest by abolishing the feudal privileges that were its primary target. What followed was a kind of competitive renunciation, as deputies from the privileged orders rose one after another to surrender rights and exemptions. Personal serfdom was abolished without compensation. Other feudal dues were declared redeemable, subject to compensation. Guild privileges, special tax exemptions, regional privileges, the sale of offices, plural benefice, holding by clergy. All were thrown onto what one participant called the funeral pyre of abuses. The atmosphere in the hall was electric, a mixture of genuine idealism and practical recognition that many of these privileges were no longer defensible or enforceable. The session continued until 3 in the morning, by which time the legal framework of the Ancien Regime had been largely dismantled. The sound of this remarkable night was the repeated applause that greeted each renunciation, the emotional voices of deputies caught up in what seemed a moment of national regeneration, and finally the solemn intonation of a Te Deum to give thanks for what had been accomplished. The decree, abolishing the feudal system, drafted in the days following this session and formally adopted on August 11, translated the night's enthusiasm into legal language. While it did not go as far as some peasants hoped, many dues were to be redeemed rather than simply abolished. It nevertheless represented a fundamental reconstruction of the relationship between the French people and the land they worked. Together with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted on August 26, it formed the twin foundation of the new order the National Assembly was attempting to construct. As August turned to September and the heat of summer began to moderate, the revolution appeared to have achieved remarkable success in a matter of weeks. The absolute monarchy had been transformed into a constitutional system. Aristocratic privilege had been legally abolished. Local governance had been reclaimed by citizens. A new language of rights and citizenship had entered public discourse. Yet beneath this apparent consensus lay continuing tensions and unresolved questions that would soon resurface. The king had accepted changes under pressure, but remained ambivalent about the new order. Economic problems persisted despite political transformation. And the revolution's most basic questions, about the distribution of power, the role of the church, the limits of change, remained to be answered in the months and years ahead. As night falls on this revolutionary summer, bringing a brief respite from the heat of the day and the passions it inflamed, we pause to reflect on how quickly the world can change when long-standing tensions finally find release. The France that would greet the autumn of 1789 was already fundamentally different from the country that had gathered the Estates General just months before. And this transformation, though centered on Paris, had touched communities throughout the nation, creating a shared experience of revolutionary participation that would shape French identity for generations to come. As summer deepened across the French countryside in 1789, the fields ripened toward harvest, a time that should have brought relief after the hunger of the lean months when last year's stores ran low. But this was no ordinary summer. The golden wheat fields and verdant vineyards existed in a landscape transformed not just by seasonal change, but by political upheaval that had shattered centuries-old patterns of authority and deference. Let us walk these rural paths, listening to the conversations in village squares and farmhouse kitchens as the revolution spread beyond Paris to transform the lives of the vast majority of French people who worked the land. The phenomenon known as the Great Fear, Grande Peur, swept across rural France in a series of waves between July 20 and August 6, 1789. It began not as a single event, but as multiple, localized panics that eventually merged and spread along France's road networks and river valleys. Imagine standing in a village square as a breathless messenger arrives, bringing news that brigands are approaching from the next province, well-armed, desperate men intent on stealing the harvest or burning property. No one has seen these brigands directly, but everyone knows someone who has fled just ahead of them. The news passes from mouth to mouth, growing more alarming with each retelling. These rumors, though largely unfounded, fell on fertile ground. Rural communities had endured a year of environmental disaster and economic hardship. The failed harvests of 1788 had led to widespread hunger. Many peasants had been forced to consume their seed grain, leaving them without means to plant the next crop. Bread prices had risen beyond what many could afford. In some regions, landlords had responded to their own financial difficulties by attempting to collect feudal dues more aggressively, adding to peasant distress. And now, with the old structures of authority in disarray following the events in Paris and Versailles, a sense of vulnerability pervaded many rural areas. The immediate response to these fears was self-organization for defense. Village bells, normally rung only for religious services, fires, or to mark the hours, now sounded the alarm, calling able-bodied men to gather with whatever weapons they could find. Improvised militias formed, sometimes led by local notables, but often by ordinary farmers who showed initiative in the crisis. Women gathered children in central locations where they could be better protected. Valuables were hidden. Barricades were erected at village entrances. The sounds of preparation echoed across the countryside. The ringing of alarm bells, the sharpening of agricultural tools pressed into service as weapons, the low murmur of strategy discussions among people unaccustomed to military matters. But a curious transformation often occurred as these defensive preparations progressed. In the absence of any actual brigands to fight, attention turned to potential enemies within or near the community, specifically to the local nobility and their chateaux. The shift from fear to action, from defense to offense, happened in different ways across regions. In some areas, it began with demands to search nobles' houses for weapons or grain hoards. In others, it focused initially on the feudal documents that recorded peasant obligations. And in some cases, It escalated directly to attacks on property and persons perceived as oppressors. Imagine the scene as a group of peasants, initially armed for defense against phantom brigands, approaches the local chateau. The summer sun beats down as they cross lands. They have worked for generations, but never owned. Their demands might begin modestly: to inspect the premises, to ensure the seigneur is not harboring threats, to verify grain supplies. But once inside the imposing walls that have symbolized authority and difference for so long, the dynamic could quickly change. Finding the feudal registers, the documents that recorded generations of payments, labor services, and obligations. The seigneur, faced with a determined crowd and without traditional means of coercion, might comply. The documents would be brought outside, often to the village square, where they would be ceremonially burned, their ashes scattered as a visible end to the old obligations. In more violent incidents, which occurred in perhaps 10% of cases, chateaux themselves were looted or burned. Wine cellars were emptied, furniture broken, symbols of aristocratic privilege destroyed. The physical violence against persons was relatively rare, but did occur, particularly when nobles resisted or where local grievances were especially bitter. The sound of breaking glass, splintering wood, and roaring flames accompanied these more extreme expressions of accumulated resentment against the feudal order. What motivated these actions? The explanation is complex, involving both immediate triggers and long-term grievances. The panic about brigands created a context where peasants were already armed and organized. The news from Paris, incomplete and often distorted as it traveled, suggested that a fundamental change in the social order was occurring, that the king himself supported the Third Estate against aristocratic privilege. Economic hardship had created a reservoir of anger, easily directed against traditional elites. And the specific targets chosen: feudal documents, dovecotes, where nobles' birds damaged peasant crops, exclusive mills where peasants were forced to grind their grain, revealed the everyday burdens that peasants found most oppressive. These rural uprisings were not merely destructive, but often displayed a kind of moral economy, a sense of justice and legitimate rights being reclaimed. Peasants frequently left behind documents explaining their actions, emphasizing that they were not attacking property rights in general but specifically feudal privileges they considered unjust. The violence, when it occurred, was usually purposeful rather than indiscriminate, and many communities established new forms of local governance to maintain order once traditional authority had been rejected. The Great Fear and associated peasant revolts marked the entry of rural France into the revolutionary process. The events in Paris, the formation of the National Assembly, the fall of the Bastille, had initially been distant news for most of the country, but the rural uprisings made revolution an immediate local reality for communities across France, involving ordinary people in direct action to reshape their conditions of life. The revolution was no longer something happening in Versailles or Paris, but a transformation occurring in their own fields and villages. The response of the National Assembly to these developments was the dramatic night session of August 4, which we discussed briefly in the previous section. The abolition of feudal privileges was at least partly motivated by a desire to address the causes of rural unrest and bring the countryside back under control. But it also represented a genuine attempt to incorporate peasant grievances into the broader revolutionary program, to make the rural majority stakeholders in the new order being created. The decree abolishing the feudal system, adopted on August 11, distinguished between different types of feudal obligations. Personal servitude was abolished outright. Other dues based on real property were declared redeemable. That is, they could be eliminated through compensation payments. This compromise satisfied neither the nobility, who felt it went too far, nor many peasants, who believed all feudal obligations should end immediately without compensation. The result was continuing tension in many rural areas, with peasants often refusing to pay dues they considered illegitimate and local authorities struggling to enforce a complex legal distinction between abolished and redeemable obligations. Despite these limitations, the reforms of August 1789 represented a profound transformation of rural life. The legal equality of all citizens, regardless of birth, was established in principle. The exclusive hunting rights of the nobility were abolished, allowing peasants to protect their crops from wildlife and supplement their diet with game. The tithe, a significant burden on agricultural production, was eliminated. And perhaps most importantly, the psychological relationship between peasant and lord was fundamentally altered. The hierarchical deference that had characterized rural society for centuries was replaced, at least in theory, by the horizontal relationship of citizens with equal rights. As summer turned to autumn in 1789, and peasants brought in what harvest they could from fields disrupted by both natural disaster and human upheaval, the countryside settled into an uneasy new normality. Local national guards were organized to maintain order. New municipal governments were elected under the supervision of the National Assembly. The most violent phase of rural revolution subsided. But the fundamental questions raised by the peasant revolts about property, justice, and the limits of revolution remained to be negotiated in the years ahead. The sounds of harvest time, the swish of scythes through grain, the creak of carts laden with produce, the communal meals celebrating completion of the work, continued as they had for centuries. But now these familiar rhythms carried new meanings in a rural world transformed by revolutionary action. As darkness falls over peaceful fields that had so recently witnessed conflict, we turn our attention back to Paris and Versailles, where the National Assembly was attempting to construct a new constitutional order that could accommodate both urban and rural visions of the revolution. In the late summer and autumn of 1789, as the immediate crises that had sparked revolutionary action subsided, the National Assembly faced the monumental task of reimagining and reconstructing the French state. The old foundations had been swept away in a matter of weeks. Absolute monarchy replaced by constitutional government, feudal privilege abolished in a single night, traditional local authorities dissolved in favor of elected bodies. Now, in the elegant meeting halls of Versailles and later in Paris, deputies debated fundamental questions about the nature of government, the rights of citizens, the organization of territory, and the relationship between church and state. Let us listen to these deliberations as a new France took shape, not through sudden upheaval, but through the measured work of drafting articles, debating amendments, and seeking compromise among competing visions. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, stands as the philosophical cornerstone of the new order. In 17 articles of remarkable concision, it established principles that were revolutionary not just for France but for human governance more broadly. That men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that the aim of political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, defined as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, that law is the expression of the general will, and must be the same for all, that citizens have the right to participate in creating legislation, that no one should be arrested or punished except according to established law, that freedom of religion, speech, and imagine sitting in the assembly hall as these principles were debated, the late summer light filtering through tall windows, the voices of deputies rising and falling as they considered how abstract philosophical concepts should be translated into governing principles. The influence of Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Rousseau and Montesquieu, was evident, as was awareness of American precedents like the Declaration of Independence and various state constitutions. But the deputies were not merely implementing existing theory. They were engaged in a creative process of political imagination, attempting to establish a new relationship between the individual and the state, between natural rights and social obligations. The Declaration was intended as a preamble to a constitution still being drafted, but it took on significance far beyond that role. It was printed and distributed throughout France, posted in public places, read aloud in town squares and village churches. Its language, clear, universal, inspiring, made it accessible to ordinary people who might never read complex constitutional provisions. It provided a set of standards against which government actions could be judged, and a vision of citizenship that emphasized rights and dignity rather than obedience and deference. The sound of its principles being discussed in cafes, workshops, and rural gatherings represented the emergence of a new political consciousness among previously marginalized groups. The constitutional work that followed the Declaration was more technical but no less transformative. The deputies faced practical questions about how to organize a state that would protect the rights they had proclaimed while functioning effectively as a national government. They drew on diverse influences: classical republicanism, English constitutional practices, American federalism, but were creating something distinctive, a constitutional monarchy for a large, centralized European state with a complex social structure and long history. One of the most fundamental decisions concerned the structure of the legislature and its relationship to the executive. After extensive debate, the Assembly opted for a unicameral legislature rather than following the English or American model of two houses. This decision reflected a desire to avoid creating an upper chamber that might become a refuge for aristocratic privilege, but it also eliminated a potential check on legislative power. The king was given a suspensive veto, the ability to delay but not permanently block legislation, positioning him as a counterbalance to the assembly without the absolute authority he had previously wielded. These arrangements attempted to create a balanced system that would prevent both despotism and what the deputies feared as democratic excess. The reorganization of local government was perhaps even more radical than these constitutional provisions. The ancient provinces of France, Brittany, Normandy, Burgundy, Provence, and others, each with its distinct customs, laws, and privileges, were abolished and replaced with 83 departments of roughly equal size, named after geographical features rather than historical identities. These departments were further divided into districts, cantons, and communes, creating a uniform administrative structure throughout the country. Local officials would be elected rather than appointed or holding office through purchase or inheritance. The sound of surveyors measuring boundaries, of new maps being unfolded in municipal offices, of electoral assemblies gathering to choose local officials marked this fundamental reorganization of the French landscape. The economic policies of the new regime reflected both philosophical commitments to liberty and practical needs for revenue. Internal customs barriers that had fragmented the French economy were abolished, creating a unified national market. Guilds that had restricted entry to trades were dissolved, allowing freedom of occupation. A new system of taxation was established, intended to be more equitable and efficient than the complex, exemption-riddled arrangements of the Ancien regime. To address the immediate financial crisis that had precipitated the revolution, the Assembly authorized a new paper currency, assignats, initially backed by confiscated church lands, but eventually becoming a fiat currency whose value would fluctuate dramatically in the years to come. Perhaps the most contentious area of reform involved the Catholic Church, which had been intimately connected with the French state for centuries. The tithe had already been abolished on August 4, depriving the Church of a major source of income. On November 2, 1789, the Assembly went further, declaring that church property was at the disposal of the nation, effectively nationalizing vast landholdings that constituted perhaps 10% of France's territory. This decision, motivated partly by financial necessity and partly by anti-clerical sentiment among some deputies, marked a decisive break with the Church's traditional status and created a powerful source of opposition to the revolution. The civil constitution of the clergy, adopted on July 12, 1790, went even further in restructuring the French Church. Dioceses were reorganized to align with the new departments, reducing their number from 135 to 83. Bishops and priests would be elected by the same citizens who chose civil officials, rather than being appointed by ecclesiastical authorities. Clergy became, in effect, salaried public servants, paid by the state, but expected to conform to its requirements. Religious orders that did not provide education or health care were suppressed. These measures, which subordinated the Church to the state and severed many of its connections to Rome, created a profound religious crisis that would eventually divide the country. The implementation of these reforms required the creation of new civic rituals and symbols to replace religious and monarchical ones that had structured public life. The Festival of Federation on July 14, 1790, marking the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, exemplified this effort. On the Champ de Mars in Paris, a vast altar to the nation was erected. Delegations from all 83 departments, along with National Guard units, regular troops, and Parisian citizens, gathered in the rain to take a civic oath. Lafayette, as commander of the National Guard, swore first, followed by the king. The sound of hundreds of thousands of voices joining in this collective commitment, accompanied by cannon salutes and patriotic music, represented an attempt to create a new kind of national community based on voluntary association rather than submission to traditional authority. These sweeping changes were not implemented without resistance. Within the assembly itself, debates grew increasingly polarized between those who believed the revolution had gone far enough and those who sought more radical transformation. Outside the assembly, various groups opposed aspects of the new order. Some clergy and devout Catholics resisted the ecclesiastical reforms. Nobles who had lost privileges, positions, and, in some cases, property, began to emigrate, forming communities in neighboring countries where they advocated for counter-revolution. In many localities, officials struggled to enforce new laws against entrenched customs and interests. The king himself remained a deeply ambivalent figure in this emerging system. Louis XVI had formally accepted the constitutional changes and even appeared to embrace some aspects of his new role as King of the French rather than King of France, a subtle but significant shift that positioned him as the nation's leader rather than its owner. But privately, he and especially Queen Marie Antoinette maintained correspondence with foreign powers and émigré nobles, seeking ways to restore their former authority. The royal family's position became increasingly precarious as revolutionary leaders questioned their commitment to the new order. This tension came to a head in June 1791 with the flight to Varennes, an unsuccessful attempt by the royal family to escape France. Disguised as ordinary travelers, the king, queen, their children, and a few companions slipped out of the Tuileries Palace on the night of June 2021 and headed for the eastern border, where they expected to be met by loyal troops. Their flight was discovered early the next morning, setting off a frantic pursuit. Recognized at the small town of Varennes, they were detained and eventually returned to Paris under guard, passing through crowds that maintained a deliberate, ominous silence, a striking contrast to the cheers that had traditionally greeted royal processions. The flight to Varennes shattered the pretense of royal cooperation with the revolution and triggered the first major constitutional crisis of the new regime. The king's actions were widely interpreted as both personal betrayal and political desertion, abandoning his post at a time when France faced threats from hostile foreign powers. Some radical voices called for his deposition and the establishment of a republic, but the majority of deputies still believed in the necessity of constitutional monarchy. After intense debate, the assembly accepted the implausible fiction that the king had been kidnapped, allowing him to retain his position under increased restrictions and surveillance. But the bond of trust between the monarch and the people had been irreparably damaged, and the idea of a republic, previously marginal, gained increasing support. Despite these tensions, by the summer of 1791, the National Assembly had largely completed its constitutional work. The Constitution of 1791, formally accepted by the King on September 14, codified the reforms of the preceding 2 years into a coherent system of government. It established France as a constitutional monarchy with separation of powers, representative government, civil equality, and protected rights. It was a remarkable achievement, In just over 2 years, a society that had known only absolute monarchy and aristocratic privilege had transformed itself through largely peaceful means into a constitutional state based on citizenship and rights. On September 30th, 1791, the National Constituent Assembly dissolved itself, to be replaced by a new legislative assembly elected under the constitutional provisions it had created. As deputies gathered for their final session, they could look back on a period of extraordinary accomplishment. They had abolished feudalism, established civil equality, created a uniform administrative system, reformed taxation, and written a constitution. France had been fundamentally transformed, not through violent overthrow, but through deliberate reconstruction according to rational principles. Yet as night falls on this first revolutionary phase, and the deputies return to homes throughout France carrying copies of the constitution they had created, we can also see the gathering shadows that would soon darken the revolutionary horizon. The king remained an uncertain partner in the new system. Religious divisions were deepening as the civil constitution of the clergy required oaths that many priests refused to take. Foreign powers watched events in France with increasing alarm, concerned about both revolutionary principles spreading beyond French borders and the fate of the French royal family. And economic problems persisted despite political transformation, creating continuing hardship for ordinary people whose expectations had been raised by revolutionary promises. The birth of this new order, achieved with such hope and idealism, would soon face tests that its creators could hardly have imagined. As the calendar turned to 1792, France would find itself facing both internal divisions and external threats that would push the revolution in more radical directions than most of the deputies of 1789 had ever contemplated. The sound of their measured debates about constitutional principles would soon be drowned out by the more urgent rhythms of a nation at war, both with foreign enemies and increasingly with itself. As autumn leaves drifted down in Paris in late 1791, covering the cobblestone streets with a golden carpet soon trampled underfoot, the French Revolution entered a new and more contentious phase. The unity of purpose that had characterized the early revolution, when deputies had sworn together on a tennis court and citizens had celebrated the fall of the Bastille with spontaneous joy, was giving way to deepening divisions about the revolution's direction, pace, and ultimate goals. Let us walk the streets of the capital and listen to the increasingly heated debates in the new legislative assembly, in political clubs, in cafes, and in the growing number of newspapers that now competed for public attention. The Legislative Assembly that convened on October 1, 1791, differed significantly from its predecessor. By Robespierre's suggestion, the National Constituent Assembly had passed a self-denying ordinance, barring its members from serving in the new legislature. This ensured that the 745 deputies of the Legislative Assembly were all newcomers to national politics, though many had gained experience in local revolutionary administration. They were generally younger and more radical than the constituents they replaced, with a larger proportion of lawyers, professionals, and men of letters, and fewer clergy and nobles. Their inexperience, combined with the difficult circumstances they faced, would contribute to the Assembly's struggles to establish its authority and maintain a consistent direction. From its earliest sessions, the Legislative Assembly displayed the political divisions that would eventually lead to its paralysis. On the right sat the Feuillants, supporters of constitutional monarchy, who sought to stabilize the revolution around the achievements already secured: equality before the law, representative government, and protected rights, all within a framework that preserved significant authority for the king. In the center were deputies unaligned with any organized faction, whose votes might shift depending on the issue at hand. And on the left were deputies increasingly known as Jacobins, though not all were members of that club, who distrusted the king, sought more radical democratic reforms, and were increasingly open to the idea of a republic. These divisions were not confined to the Assembly Hall, but extended throughout French society, finding expression in a proliferation of political clubs and newspapers that made Paris the epicenter of an unprecedented public debate about the nature and direction of the revolution. The Jacobin Club, founded in 1789 as the Society of Friends of the Constitution, had initially included deputies from across the political spectrum, but was becoming increasingly radical under the influence of leaders like Brissot and eventually Robespierre. The Cordeliers Club, more populist in its membership and approach, advocated direct democracy and universal male suffrage. The Feuillants Club, formed after a split in the Jacobins in July 1791, represented more moderate, constitutionalist positions. Each of these organizations maintained correspondence with affiliated societies throughout France, creating networks that could mobilize opinion and action across the country. The press, freed from pre-revolutionary censorship, flourished in this atmosphere of political ferment. Hundreds of new periodicals appeared, ranging from serious analytical journals to inflammatory pamphlets. Radical voices like Marat's L'Ami du Peuple and Hébert's Le Père du Chien competed with moderate publications like the Moniteur Universel and royalist sheets that defended the Ancien Regime. The sound of printing presses working through the night, of newspaper vendors crying their wares in the streets, of public readings for those who could not read themselves, created a constant backdrop of political discourse unprecedented in its volume and intensity. Three major issues dominated this increasingly divided political landscape during the Legislative Assembly's tenure: the status of non-juring priests who had refused to accept the civil constitution of the clergy, the threat posed by émigré nobles gathering in neighboring countries, and the question of war with European powers, seen as hostile to the revolution. Each of these issues forced deputies and citizens to choose sides, deepening divisions that would eventually tear the revolutionary coalition apart. The religious schism created by the civil constitution of the clergy had grown more serious since the requirement, imposed in November 1790, that all priests take an oath to support the document. Only about half the clergy nationwide had complied, with significant regional variations. In Paris and the East, a majority took the oath, while in the West and South, most refused. This created parallel religious structures in many communities: constitutional, priests who were legally recognized and state-supported, but often viewed with suspicion by traditionalist parishioners, and refractory, or non-juring priests, who maintained the loyalty of many Catholics but had no legal status and increasingly faced restrictions on their ministry. The Legislative Assembly, dominated by men of Enlightenment views who had little sympathy for what they saw as religious obscurantism, took increasingly harsh measures against non-juring clergy. Decrees passed in November 1791 required them to take the civic oath or lose their pensions and face designation as suspects. In May 1792, further legislation authorized the deportation of non-juring priests if 20 citizens in their community requested it. The king, who had reluctantly accepted the civil constitution but whose personal religious convictions made him sympathetic to the non-jurors, vetoed these measures, using the limited power granted him by the Constitution. This veto, along with another on measures against émigrés, severely damaged his already compromised position and contributed to the growing Republican sentiment in Paris. The issue of the émigrés, nobles and others who had fled France since the revolution began, became increasingly pressing during this period. From bases in cities like Koblenz, Turin, and Brussels, émigré leaders like the King's brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, called for counter-revolution and sought support from foreign powers to restore the Ancien Regime. Though their actual military strength was limited, their rhetoric and activities created fears of invasion and internal subversion. The Legislative Assembly responded with decrees sequestering émigré property and threatening them with death if they did not return by January 1792, measures also vetoed by the king. But the most consequential issue facing the Legislative Assembly was the question of war. By early 1792, a faction within the Jacobins led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot, and thus often called the Brissotins, though later known as Girondins, was advocating for war against Austria and Prussia, whose rulers had issued the Declaration of Pillnitz in August 1791, suggesting they might intervene in France under certain circumstances. The Brissenden argument for war combined several elements: patriotic defense of the revolution against foreign threats, the belief that war would expose the king's true loyalties, the hope that conflict would unite the nation behind revolutionary principles, and the idealistic vision of exporting revolution to other European peoples ready to embrace liberty. Opposition to this war policy came from several quarters. The Feuillants feared that war would destabilize the fragile constitutional settlement and possibly lead to military dictatorship. A minority faction within the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, argued that the war would serve counter-revolutionary interests by empowering generals and foreign enemies while distracting from needed domestic reforms. "No one loves armed missionaries," Robespierre warned, challenging the Brissenden belief that French armies would be welcomed as liberators abroad. Despite these objections, the war party prevailed. On April 20, 1792, France declared war on Austria, beginning a conflict